Hey, we're live. We're back at the ongoing teaching at Say Their Name Square. We're day 10, but we're going to jump back to day 9's book because we didn't finish it. Chapter 14, right? All right, I'm supposed to do chapter 14. Starting with chapter 14. Let's see. From the beginning, I guess. Okay, wham, we got a long way to go. Page 208. "13, 14. Alright, this is yesterday's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. Chapter 14, page 208, The Intrusion of Caste in Everyday Life. A father and his young son were out at a restaurant in Oakland on one of their precious days together. Now that the mother and father had separated, the little boy ordered what he thought he wanted, but when the food came, he said he just wanted to drink his juice. The father had been worried about the effect the disruption in the family might be having on his son and wanted to keep the same stability and order in his little boy's life. He wanted to hold to the same standards they had always had, of showing gratitude for the blessing of food and eating what the universe had seen fit to put before you, of keeping to the manners they had established when they were all together. Mainly he wanted his son to get nourishment, didn't want to return him to his mother hungry, as he surely would be if he filled his little stomach with sweet juice and snacks. He remembered the times he'd filled up on sweets and had no space left for mealtime. What he couldn't tell his son at that moment, but would have to tell him later when he was big enough to understand, was that he would have to grow up respecting authority. One day he would no longer be adorable little toddler, but would be a black teenager or grown man, and respecting authority, following the rules, could mean his very life. This was his only child, the most precious human in the world to him. The boy was so sweet-faced, innocent, and free. How could he tell him that the world, his country, saw him as a threat, when exactly is the best time to break a child's heart? Should a parent clip them a little at a time, spread it out to spare them the pain of a single blow? Should a parent sit them down and get it over with? You could argue that the sooner a child knows, the safer, more prepared he will be. Maybe a parent should hold off as long as he can, give his child the longest possible chance to be a child. He'll have the rest of his life, decades, to live with reality, adjust himself to the truth. Maybe the most loving thing to do is to wait. Wait until something happens. Somebody drops the N-word on him at the playground, or a teacher checks him for running down the hall, but not his white schoolmates, and he knows it's wrong and wants to know why. Back in 2014, Tamir Rice was 12 when officers shot him within seconds of their arrival, as he stood in a Cleveland park playing with a pellet gun. Despite the fact that Ohio was an open carry state and it is a common occurrence for boys to have toy guns, an all-American thing to do, Tamir Rice happened to be the same age as the fictional Jim when the beloved fictional father, Atticus Finch, gave him an air rifle in To Kill a Mockingbird, the very scene from which the title comes. Lots of American boys play with guns, are given guns, and are killed for it. Tamir Rice died before he could ask why. This father in Oakland didn't believe in guns, and that wasn't the issue anyway. The issue was his son's life and what the father could do to protect it. The challenge for a parent in the subordinate caste is to calculate the precise and optimal moment to break the truth to a child before the caste system does it for him, to figure out how to stretch their innocence until the last possible moment before it is too late. Another father, an immigrant from West Africa, had to find a way to push past his sorrow to break the news to his little boy that he could no longer be a child, that he could not jump and dart and shriek like the other children. He would have to tell his son that it was too dangerous. They were in America now. The father in Oakland was a respected professor at a local college. In fact, African American history was his field. He would figure it out when the time came. That moment was weighing on him, but that day was not today. The father looked back at his son and told him he needed to go ahead and eat his vegetables first, like Daddy said, and then he could drink his juice. The little boy scrunched his face and shook his head and began to cry. A woman at a nearby booth had been listening to their exchange. She was an older, grayish blonde woman with the dominant caste. From the dominant caste, she scooted from her booth and walked over to the table where the father and son were sitting. The father could see the shadow of her form moving toward them. The woman stopped and stood over them. She leaned toward the little boy and told him, "You drink your juice if you want to. It's okay to drink your juice." The woman did not address or acknowledge the father. She focused her attention on the little boy as she stood there. The father was beside himself. A perfect stranger had gotten up, disregarded a parent, and told a child to disobey the parent right in the parent's face. The woman had crossed so many boundaries it was hard to process. Something had made her feel entitled enough to enter into the private space of people she did not know and veto a father's decision regarding his own son. This was Oakland, bright blue home of Huey and Tupac, where such phrases as gender nonconforming and microaggressions are part of everyday language. The woman would not have gotten up if she didn't perceive she had a right to. Had she done this to other parents? Would she have breezed past a white father, ignored him to tell his son to do precisely what the father had just told him not to? The father held up his hand like a traffic officer signaling a car to stop. "Ma'am, you need to go sit down. Don't come to my table. I don't know you," the father said. The woman looked stunned at the rejection, but turned around and went back to her booth. The father had a hard time enjoying his food after that, his own food after that. He would remember this moment long afterward. The United States has a centuries-old history of people in the upper caste controlling and overriding the rightful role of lower caste parents and their children, the most extreme of which was selling off children from their parents, even infants who had yet to be weaned from their mothers, as with fillies or pups rather than human beings. One of them, remarked an enslaver, was worth $200 the moment it drew breath. This routine facet of slavery prevailed in our country for a quarter millennium. Children and parents denied the most elemental of human bonds. Even when children were permitted to remain with their parents, caste protocols undermined their authority and punished them if they tried to protect their own children. A mother in Louisiana was administered 25 lashes for countermanding an order given her son by the white mistress who owned them. Several of the most gruesome whippings and tortures were administered on enslaved men who intervened in cases of violence against their wives or children at the hands of an enslaver or overseer. Thus, enslaved parents could offer their children little shelter or security from the frightening creatures that lorded over them, historian Kenneth M. Stamp wrote. Nor could they protect themselves. But if the upper caste did not see the evil in this, the lowest caste children could see it. Once, when an overseer tied a woman up and whipped her in front of her children, the frightened children pelted the overseer with stones, Stamp wrote, and one of them ran up and bit him in the leg. As they cried for him to let her go, the caste system may have treated them as cattle or machinery, but the children responded instantly as human beings the dominant caste refused to see. It was only in the mid-20th century, with the protections arising from the civil rights era, that black parents had legal and political recourse to shield their children from abuse, or to call into account harm done to their children at the hands of the state. But the essential contours of the hierarchy remained intact. The modes of expression have mutated with the times. Modern-day caste protocols are less often about overt attacks or conscious hostility, and can be dispiritingly hard to fight. They are like the wind, powerful enough to knock you down, but invisible as they go about their work. They are sustained by the muscle memory of relative rank and the expectations of how one interacts with others based on their place in the hierarchy. It's a form of status hypervigilance, the entitlement of the dominant caste to step in and assert itself wherever it chooses, to monitor or dismiss those deemed beneath them as they see fit. It is not about luxury cars and watches, country clubs and private banks, but knowing without thinking that you are one up from another based on rules, not set down in paper, but reinforced in most every commercial, television show, or billboard, from boardrooms to newsrooms to gated subdivisions, to who gets killed first in the first half hour of a movie. This is the blindsiding banality of caste. Every day across America, wherever two or more are gathered, caste can infect the most ordinary of interchanges, catching us off guard, disrupting and confusing, and potentially causing mayhem for anyone in the hierarchy. These are scenes of caste in action. The doorbell rang at the home of an accountant from the dominant caste in a wealthy suburb of a Midwestern city. The accountant and his family had only recently moved into the neighborhood. Through the glass side lights of his front door he could see a woman, an African-American woman, there on his landing. He knew exactly what this meant. The dry cleaner in town offered its customers pick-up and drop-off, so he went to get the clothes that needed cleaning, and then opened the door to hand the armload of tousled clothes to the woman waiting out front. The woman stepped back. "Oh, I'm not the dry cleaner," the woman said. "I'm your next-door neighbor. I came over to introduce myself and welcome you to the neighborhood." The woman was the fashionable wife of a prominent cardiologist, exceedingly upper class, yet labeled subordinate caste on sight. Still, to someone who had just moved next door to her, they would both have to recover from that one. A college professor in Chicago had just returned from a bike ride and picked up his mail in the lobby of his apartment building off Michigan Avenue. He was African American, in his 30s, patrician of face. Still in his helmet and cycling gear, he stepped onto the elevator en route to his floor, and barely noticing the other man on the elevator with him, began going through his mail. He saw something of interest and unsealed one of his envelopes. The other man was horrified. "You're supposed to be delivering the mail, not opening it." This seemed to have come out of nowhere, and the college professor looked up and saw that the other man was white, but didn't fully register the accusation, was just going about his day, and gave an honest reply. "Oh, I want to see what's inside," the professor said. The other man looked even more stricken now. Shaking his head in disgust, mistakenly believing he was witnessing a crime in progress. The professor got off on his floor, and only later did it occur to him that he had been taken for a delivery boy in his own building, an assumption so ludicrous he hadn't bothered to consider it in the moment, which left the dominant caste man convinced that he had just seen a black messenger brazenly break open an actual resident's mail in full view of another resident. This is the self-perpetuating mischief of caste. The phone kept ringing at the civil engineer's desk. He had deadlines to meet and projects bearing down on him. But over and over the phone broke his concentration and wasted his limited time. The engineer was from the dominant caste, and so too was the man pestering him. On the face of it, the intrusion would seem to have nothing to do with caste. Here was a white contractor calling a white engineer for answers about a project underway. The engineer was a supervisor with a general idea of the project, but the project was not his. It belonged to another engineer on the team, as the contractor well knew, one who happened to be African American and a woman. The white contractor had been told to go to her with any questions he had, but the contractor had ignored her, ignored protocol, and had gone to the dominant caste engineer instead. The white engineer answered the contractor's questions at first to be polite and move things along. The phone kept ringing, and it was disrupting his own work, and it was hindering the project in question. The black engineer could hear this unfold in front of her from her cubicle next to the white engineer's. From her desk, she could hear it every time his phone rang, while hers sat mute and silent. She could hear the white engineer's impatient replies to questions that both of them knew should have come to her. The white engineer grew agitated with disbelief. When the contractor called him the next time, the white engineer let him have it. I indicated to you from the beginning that you need to talk to D about day-to-day matters, the white engineer said. If you have a problem with that, we'll have to find another contractor for the job. The minute the white engineer hung up, the black engineer's phone rang. On an ordinary workday, the caste system had pulled a dominant caste man into its undertow. It had drained him of time and disrupted the operation. He found himself in an unexpected fight against an invisible foe, forced to take a stand for his colleague and against, perhaps unbeknownst to him, on a conscious level, the caste system itself. If there is anything that distinguishes caste, however, it is first the policing of roles expected of people based on what they look like. And second, the monitoring of boundaries, the disregard for the boundaries of subordinate castes, or the passionate construction of them by those in the dominant caste, to keep the hierarchy in place. After the 2016 election, the surveillance of black citizens by white strangers became so common a feature of American life that these episodes have inspired memes of their own. Videos gone viral, followed by apologies from management or an announcement of company-wide diversity training. People in the dominant caste have been caught on video inserting themselves into the everyday lives of black people they do not know, and calling the police on them as they wait for a friend at a Starbucks in Philadelphia or try to enter their own condo building in St. Louis. It is a distant echo of an earlier time when anyone in the dominant caste was deputized, obligated even to apprehend any black person during the era of slavery. With the resurgence of caste after the 2016 election, people in the dominant caste have been recorded calling the police on ordinary black citizens under a wide range of ordinary circumstances, with videos cropping up almost daily at one point. In New Haven, Connecticut, a woman called campus police on a graduate student at Yale University who had fallen asleep while studying in the common area of her dormitory. Officers demanded her identification even after she unlocked the door to her dorm room. You're in a Yale building, an officer said, and we need to make sure you belong here. In Milwaukee, a woman called the police on a corrections officer whose key fob had malfunctioned as he tried to open his own car door. A man called the police on a software engineer who was waiting for a friend outside a condo building in San Francisco. As the white man briefed the authorities from his cell phone, the man's little boy, uncomfortable with his father's actions, begged him to hang up and let it go. A woman walking her dog stood and blocked a marketing consultant from getting into his own condo building in St. Louis. She demanded that he show proof that he lived there before she would step aside. When he walked past her, she followed him into the elevator and onto his floor to see if he in fact lived there. In the video that the man took as a precaution, she can be seen tracking him all the way to his apartment, checking whether he was a resident, even after he unlocked his door to go inside. And a woman began to stalk a black man in Georgia when she saw him out with two white children. From her car, the woman trailed Corey Lewis, their babysitter, as he drove from a Walmart to a gas station and to his home after he did not permit the woman, a complete stranger, to talk with the children alone to see if they were all right. Lewis, a youth pastor who runs an after-school program, started recording the situation on his cell phone. In it, the children can be seen calm and unfazed, buckled in their seat belts in the back of his car. His voice is strained and disbelieving. "This lady is following me," he says in the video, "all because I got two kids in the back seat that do not look like me." The woman called 911 and asked if she should keep following him. She continued to trail him even though she was told not to. By the time Lewis got home, a patrol car had pulled up behind him, an officer heading towards him. "Jesus have mercy, what is wrong with this country?" A woman outside of the camera frame cried. The officer told the children, a 6-year-old boy and a 10-year-old girl, to step out of the car, and Lewis's face grew tense. The outcome of this police encounter and his very safety depended on what those children said, and he asked them to please tell the officer who he was. "Please," he said to them. Satisfied that Lewis was, in fact, their babysitter and that the children were okay, the officer, just to be safe, called the parents who were out at dinner. "It just knocked us out of our chair," the children's father, David Parker, told the New York Times. After a reporter asked one of the children, 10-year-old Addison, what she would tell the woman who followed them that day, her father told the Times her response. "I would just ask her to next time try to see us as three people rather than three skin colors, because we might have been Mr. Lewis's adopted children." These intrusions of caste would seem to harm the targets more than anyone, given the widely publicized attacks and shootings of black citizens at the hands of police. But Americans know by now that calling the police on a black person can carry life and death consequences. Frivolous calls squander public resources and distract police from actual serious crime to the detriment of us all. That's arguable. Beyond that, when any citizen is disrupted in the midst of everyday life and responsibilities, it is, in fact, a societal disruption, a tear in the daily workings of human interaction. These people are a part of the American economy. When they are interrupted, schools and business and institutions suffer an invisible loss in output as their workers get blindsided from their tasks. These intrusions serve to reinforce caste by derailing lower class caste people, subverting their work lives in an already competitive society, imposing additional burdens not borne by their dominant caste colleagues as they go about their work, as occurred to me in Michigan some years ago. I could hear footsteps behind me, but paid little attention. This was an airport, and there were footfalls and roller bags all around. I had just landed in Detroit on an early morning flight from Chicago for interviews I needed to conduct as a national correspondent for the New York Times. I'd already lost an hour going from Central to Eastern Time, and I was thinking of all I'd have to do in the space of the next 8 hours. If the first interview was at 10:30 and it took me 40 minutes to get downtown, maybe more since this was rush hour, I needed to get straight to the rental car to make this work. Any delays in the day's interviews, and I might not make the flight back to Chicago that evening. I thought to myself that I'd worry about that later and just get to the Avis bus as soon as I could. Thought about how it always seems that the shuttle you're looking for is the one that has just pulled off, and no matter what company you've booked, the one you need is always the last to show up. I was walking fast because I always walk fast, and I was heading to the sliding glass doors in the direction of the shuttle stop when I heard them. The footsteps were closer and faster and heading towards me. Why would anybody be heading towards me? It was a man and a woman. It happened to be a white man and a white woman, the woman's light brown hair swinging just above her shoulders as she ran. They had a parka and corduroy look about them, and both were out of breath as they reached me. "We need to talk to you," they said, walking alongside me. I could see the shuttle bus lane through the sliding glass doors and buses pulling up, and was not fully registering whatever it was they were saying. "Why are you in Detroit? What are you here for?" "I'm on business. I'm here for work." I was thinking that I did not have time for whatever travel survey they were conducting, and now I could see that Avis was on schedule. The shuttle bus was pulling up to the curb. People were queuing up to board. "I have to catch my shuttle bus," I told them as I walked out of the terminal doors. "Where are you coming from?" they asked, one on each side of me now. "I just flew in from Chicago," I said, nearing the cloud of people in suits and overcoats boarding the shuttle bus. "Is that where you live?" "Why are you asking me this? I need to get on the bus." "We need to know if you live in Chicago and what you're doing in Detroit." The last of the passengers were climbing on board. The doors of the bus were wide open. The driver was looking down at me and at them. The man and the woman stood there holding up the bus, holding up the passengers, holding up me. "What is this for?" "We're the DEA. We need to know where you live, how long you will be in Detroit, and exactly what you're doing here." This was too preposterous to comprehend. The Drug Enforcement Administration. Why in the world were they stopping me? Out of all the travelers at the airport, this was a day trip, so I didn't have luggage, like a lot of business travelers between cities close to each other. I was in a suit like everyone else, coach bag slung over my shoulder, covering the Midwest as I was at the time. I used to tell people that I catch planes like other people catch the subway. Airports were a second home to me. How could they not see that I was like every other business traveler boarding the shuttle? The people on the bus were checking their watches and glaring down at me through the windows as I stood at the steps. The driver shifted in his seat, and I could hear the shake of the engine, the snort of the brakes, transmission about to shift, the driver's impatient hand on the door pull. I blurted out what they wanted to know so that they would leave me alone. "I live in Chicago. I'm here for the day. I'm a reporter for the New York Times. I need to get on the bus." "We will allow you to board. We will have to ride with you." I was shaking now as I climbed onto the shuttle, its air thick with the scorn of fellow travelers. I looked for an empty seat, people pulling away as I sat down. The whole exchange had delayed everyone on the bus, and for all that anyone could see, it was because of a woman, a black woman who probably didn't even belong with real business travelers and might be a criminal to boot. The two agents took seats directly in front of me, staring and assessing, their eyes never leaving me. Twitter did not exist, and there were no cameras on cell phones to go into video mode. The bus was filled with business people, white people, or I should say white business people. I was the only African American on the bus and one of the few women, and there were two agents surveilling me and my every move. The other passengers glared at me and at the two agents and back at me. I was in utter disbelief, too shocked even to register fear. It was a psychic assault to sit there, accused and condemned, not just by the agents, but by everyone on the bus who looked with contempt and disdain, seeing me as not like them when I was exactly like them, a frequent flyer on business like anyone else on the bus. Early on a weekday morning, having just flown into a major American city and needing to focus on the work that I, like them, was there to do. I wanted to proclaim my innocence of whatever it was that all of them were thinking. When you are raised middle class and born to a subordinated caste in general, the African American in particular, you are keenly aware of the burden you carry, and you know that working twice as hard is a given. But more important, you know there will be no latitude for a misstep. You must try to be virtually perfect at all times merely to tread water. You live with the double standard even though you do not like it. You know growing up that you cannot get away with the things that your white friends might skate by with. Adolescent pranks or shoplifting or a dare or cursing out a teacher, you knew better even if you were so inclined, which I wasn't and I never have been. I needed to regain my composure and clear myself of the accusation of their presence. They hadn't believed I was a reporter, so I decided to be conspicuously what I was. I fished my pen and notebook out of my bag. I figured nobody could stop me from taking notes. It was a natural and protective reflex for me, like breathing. I had a captive audience bearing witness to my performance of emergency journalism. In silence, I looked across at the agents and with my quaking right hand made notes of what they were wearing, what they looked like, how they were looking at me. They hadn't expected this, and they turned to look out of a window and down at the floor. It was a long ride to the car rental lot. Now they felt the sting of inspection as I jotted down everything I could about them, and in that moment I took back some fraction of the power they had taken from me, proved who and what I was to anyone watching, or at least that was how it felt to me at the time. Soon the bus pulled into the Avis lot, and I took a deep breath. They had ridden all the way from the airport, trailing me, and I had no idea what the next step would be. When the bus came to a stop, I stood up like the other passengers. The agents looked up from their seats. "Have a nice day," they said, and it was over just like that. Except for it wasn't. I somehow made it to the rental counter and somehow got the keys to a car, but I don't remember any of it. What I recall is getting turned around in a parking lot that I had been to a dozen of times, going in circles, not able to get out, not registering the signs to the exit, not seeing how to get to Interstate 94 when I knew full well how to get to I-94 after all the times I'd driven it. Now in the car, away from the agents, I was beginning to comprehend the seriousness of that encounter, only now able to admit my terror. The other business travelers were likely well on their way to their appointments, perhaps annoyed at the delay, but able to make preparations in their heads for their meetings, maybe get a coffee on the way. This was a thievery of caste, stealing the time and psychic resources of the marginalized, draining energy in an already uphill competition. They were not, like me, frozen and disoriented, trying to make sense of a public violation that seemed all the more menacing now that I could see it in full. The quiet mundanity of that terror has never left me, the scars outliving the cut. We are told over and over again in our society not to judge a book by its cover, not to assume what is inside before we have had a chance to read it. Yet humans size up and make assumptions about the humans based upon what they look like many times a day. We prejudge complicated breathing beings in a way we are told never to judge inanimate objects. That was chapter 14 of Caste, intrusions of caste in everyday life. Goes through a lot of stories. Stories of caste being used against people, calling the police. It's day 10, ongoing teach-in. It's been raining all day. We finished A Peculiar Indifference. Now we're moving back to yesterday's book that we didn't finish. It's called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. The Origins of Our Discontents. We're in chapter 15, The Urgent Necessity of a Bottom Rung. It turns out that the greatest threat to a caste system is not lower caste failure, which is in a caste system is expected and perhaps even counted upon, but lower caste success, which is not. Achievement by those in the lowest caste goes against the script handed down to us all. It undermines the core assumptions upon which a caste system is constructed and to which the identities of people on all rungs of the hierarchy are linked. Achievement by marginalized people who step outside the roles expected of them puts things out of order and triggers primeval and often violent backlash. The scholar W.E.B. Du Bois recognized this phenomenon in his research into what happened after the end of the Civil War. The masters feared their former slaves' success, he wrote, far more than their anticipated failure. Decades after the Civil War, the entire world was at war and well into a fourth year of trench combat that was tearing Europe apart. The year was 1918, after the Americans had finally sent in their troops. The French welcomed the reinforcement during World War I, had badly needed it. The French began commanding some of the American troops, and it was then that the problems began. The French were treating the soldiers according to their military rank rather than their rank in the American caste system. They were treating black soldiers as they would white soldiers, as they would treat other human beings, having drinks with them, patting their shoulders for a job well done. This rankled the white soldiers in an era of total segregation back home, and this breach had to be put to a stop. American military command informed the French of how they were to treat the black soldiers, clarified for them that these men were inferior beings, no matter how well they performed on the front lines, that it was of the utmost importance that they be treated as inferior. The fact that military command would take the time in the middle of one of the most vicious wars in human history to instruct foreigners on the necessity of demeaning their own countrymen suggests that they considered adherence to caste protocols to be as important as conducting the war itself. As it was, the white soldiers were refusing to fight in the same trenches as black soldiers and refusing to salute black superiors. The American military communicated its position, and French commanders in turn had to convey the rules to their soldiers and officers who had come to admire the black soldiers and had developed a camaraderie with them. The indulgence of this familiarity, read the announcement, are matters of grievous concern to the Americans. They consider them an affront to their national policy. In apprising their officers of new protocols, French command noted the contradictions given that the black American soldiers sent us have been the choicest with respect to physique and morals. Still, in trying to translate the rules of the American caste system, the French command gave the directive: we cannot deal with them on the same plane as with the white American officers without deeply wounding the latter. We must not eat with them, must not shake hands or seek to talk or meet with them outside the requirements of military service. More pointedly, the French officers were told, we must not commend too highly the black American troops, particularly in presence of white Americans. It is all right to recognize their good qualities in their service, but only in moderate terms. Later, in the final months of the war, an African-American soldier, Private Burton Holmes, was grievously wounded in a hail of machine gun fire and heavy German artillery in an ambush of his unit in September 1918. He managed to make his way back to the command post to exchange rifles because the one he had been given was malfunctioning. Commanders wanted to get him to the hospital for treatment, but he refused and rejoined the fight with a backup rifle. He continued to fire upon the enemy until his last breath. Another African American in Company C, Freddie Stowers, crawled into enemy shelling and led the assault on German trenches. He too died on the front line defending France and America. White officers who had witnessed their bravery broke with caste and nominated both men for the Medal of Honor. But this was the height of the eugenics era, when black inferiority was near universal convention in American culture. The government refused to grant the medal to either soldier. The award intended for Holmes was downgraded to a lesser citation, and the recommendation for Stowers was lost for half a century. These actions were in keeping with societal norms that people in the lowest caste were not to be commended even in death, lest the living begin to think themselves equal, get uppity, out of their place, and threaten the that the upper caste kept telling itself in the world. Imagine Imagine Dr. Jeff Gusky, a physician who decades later took an interest in the case, told the Army Times in 2018, how powerful this would have been in the American press if word got out that there were 2 black soldiers who died in this ambush and were both nominated for the Medal of Honor. A generation later, during the Second World War, there was continued resistance to the lowest caste rising from its assigned place, even in the most mundane of endeavors. One day in the spring of 1942, white Army officers happened to assign black soldiers to direct traffic in Lincolnton, Georgia, as an Army convoy passed through. It caused an uproar in town. The sight of black men in uniform standing at an intersection, halting white motorists, apparently sent some residents over the edge, wrote the historian Jason Morgan Ward. After the war ended, in February 1946, Sergeant Isaac Woodard Jr. was riding a Greyhound bus home to North Carolina from Augusta, Georgia, where he had been honorably discharged, having served in the Pacific Theater. At a stop along the way, Woodard asked the bus driver if he could step off the bus to relieve himself. The driver told him to sit down, that he didn't have time to wait. Woodard stood up to the driver and told him, I am a man just like you. Woodard had been out of the country and away from Jim Crow for 3 years and had served his country and taken on a degree of assertiveness and self-confidence that most Southern whites were not accustomed to nor prepared to accept. In the words of the Southern author and judge Richard Gergel, the driver backed down for the time being, told him to go ahead then and hurry back. But at the next stop, outside Aiken, South Carolina, the bus driver notified the police. There, the police chief arrested Woodard on charge of disorderly conduct. I have that charge. At the bus stop and later in jail. The police chief beat him and jabbed his eyes with the billy club, blinding him. Oh, you gotta be fucking kidding me. The next day, a local judge found him guilty as charged, and though he asked to see a doctor, the authorities did not give him one for several more days. By the time he was finally transferred to an Army hospital, it was too late to save his eyesight. He was blind for the rest of his life. The NAACP brought the case to the attention of President Harry S. Truman, a Midwestern moderate who was incensed to learn that the authorities in South Carolina had taken no action in the maiming of an American soldier. He ordered the Justice Department to investigate based on the fact that Woodard was in uniform at the time he was beaten and that the initial assault occurred at a bus stop on federal property. But the federal trial ran into caste obstructions in South Carolina. The local prosecutor relied solely on the testimony of the bus driver who had called the police. The defense attorney hurled racial epithets in open court at the blinded sergeant, and when the all-white jury returned a not guilty verdict for the police chief, the courtroom broke out in cheers. It had been revealed during the trial that Woodard had apparently said yes instead of yes sir to the police chief during the arrest. This, combined with the elevated position his uniform conveyed, this was seen as reason enough for punishment in the caste system. After the trial, the police chief, who had admitted to jabbing Woodard in the eyes, went free. Woodard went north to New York as part of the Great Migration. The northern white judge assigned to the case lamented, I was shocked by the hypocrisy of my government. The message was clear to those whose lives depended on staying in their place or appearing to. If a Negro rises, he will be careful not to become conspicuous, lest he be accused of putting on airs and thus arouse resentment, wrote the ethnographer Bertram Shriek. Experience or example has taught him that competition and jealousy from the lower classes of whites often form an almost unsurpassable obstacle to his progress. It was largely black efforts to rise beyond their station that set off the backlash of lynchings and massacres after Reconstruction following the Civil War, that sparked the founding of the Ku Klux Klan and the imposition of Jim Crow laws to keep the lowest caste in its place. A white mob massacred some 60 black people in Ocoee, Florida, on Election Day in 1920, burning black homes and businesses to the ground, lynching and castrating black men, and driving the remaining black population out of town. After a black man tried to vote, the historian Paul Ortiz has called the Ocoee riot the single bloodiest election day in modern American history. It occurred amid a wave of anti-black pogroms in more than a dozen American cities, from East St. Louis to Chicago to Baltimore, as black Southerners arrived north during the Great Migration, and many tried to make their claims to citizenship after risking their lives in the Great War. One thing these rampages had in common: the mobs tended to go after the most prosperous and the lowest caste, those who might have managed to surpass even some people in the dominant caste. In the 1921 riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a mob leveled the section of town that was called Black Wall Street, owing to the black banking, insurance, and other businesses clustered together and surrounded by well-kept brick homes that signaled prosperity. These were burned to the ground and never recovered. Decades before, in the early 1890s, a black grocery and a white grocery sat across the street from each other at an intersection just outside Memphis, Tennessee. The black store, known as People's Grocery, was a cooperative that was thriving even as the walls of Jim Crow closed in. Its owner, Thomas H. Moss, was an upright figure in the three-piece suit and bow tie with a side part in his close-cropped hair, but did double duty delivering mail and running the grocery. Both he and his grocery store drew the resentment of his white competitor. One day, two boys, one black and one white, were playing marbles in front of the People's Grocery and got into an argument. The white boy's father began to thrash the black boy, at which point two clerks from the black grocery ran out to rescue him. A crowd gathered and tensions rose. Seizing on the discord and angered by the competition from the black store to begin with, the white grocer, William Barrett, showed up at People's Grocery looking for one of the store clerks who had intervened in the fracas. But the clerk on duty, Calvin McDowell, refused him any information. The white grocer struck McDowell with a pistol for his perceived insolence. McDowell managed to wrestle the gun from the white grocer and fired, barely missing him. Under the protocols of the caste system, it was the black store clerk who was arrested. Though he was released, the caste system had only begun to stir. The black owner, Thomas Moss, tried to prepare for it. He stationed several black men to guard the grocery. On March 5th, 1892, 6 white men stormed People's Grocery. The black grocer and his supporters fired upon the intruders, wounding 2 of them. The white men happened to have been the sheriff and 5 men he had been just deputized. After the shooting, 100 more whites were deputized to hunt down the black store owner and the other black men he knew. The 3 black storekeepers, the owner, Moss, and the 2 clerks, McDowell and Will Stewart, were arrested. In the early morning hours of March 9, 1892, a mob stormed the jail and tortured and lynched all 3 men. The next day, a white mob ransacked People's Grocery, and within months, Moss's white competitor bought the store for pennies on the dollar. One of Moss's dear friends was the journalist Ida B. Wells, and this lynching is what set her on her lifelong mission to awaken the country to the terror of lynching. A finer, cleaner man than he never walked the streets of Memphis, Wells wrote. He was murdered with no more consideration than a dog. The colored people feel that every white man in Memphis who consented in his death is as guilty as those who fired the guns which took his life. The irony of the quest of the lowest caste is that it is very uprightness embodied by Moss, attested to by Wells, and applauded when shown by most every other group, that incites the greatest backlash. The effort to escape stigma is what can trigger the punishment. Moss was murdered for running a better business than his white competitor, wrote Nathaniel C. Ball, a historian at the Hooks Institute at the University of Memphis. McDowell for forgetting his place in the hierarchy in the white world he lived in, and Stewart for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The lowest caste was to remain in its place like an ill-fitting suit that must constantly be altered. Seams and darts resewn to fit the requirements of the upper caste, going back to the enslavers who resented displays of industriousness and intellect in the people they saw themselves as owning. When slaves earned money, they became vain and arrogant, wrote the historian Kenneth Stamp, and felt more independent. They were not to be credited for their ideas or innovations, even at the risk of progress for everyone. Crediting them would undermine the pretext for their enslavement, meaning their presumed inferiority in anything other than servitude. In the summer of 1721, an epidemic of smallpox, one of the deadliest afflictions of the era, besieged the city of Boston. It sent stricken people into quarantine, red flags signaling to all who might pass, "God have mercy on this house." Cotton Mather was a Puritan minister and lay scientist in Boston, and had come into possession of an African man named Onesimus, Onesimus. The enslaved African told of a procedure he had undergone back in his homeland that protected him from this illness. People in West Africa had discovered that they could fend off contagions by inoculating themselves with a specimen of fluid from an infected person. Mather was intrigued by the idea Onesimus described. He researched it and decided to call it variolation. It would become the precursor to immunization and the holy grail of smallpox prevention for Western doctors and scientists, wrote the medical ethicist and author Harriet A. Washington. During the 1721 outbreak, Mather tried to persuade Bostonians to protect themselves from with this revolutionary method, but did not anticipate the resistance and rage, the horrid clamor that arose from Bostonians. The idea sounded outlandish to them. They feared it could spread smallpox all the more, and they also wanted nothing to do with a practice that had come from Africa and had been suggested by an African slave. Physicians dismissed the procedure out of hand and resented being told by a gaggle of ministers that Africans had devised the panacea they had long sought, Washington wrote. Rage turned to violence when someone hurled a lighted grenade into Mather's house. Mather escaped serious injury, but wrote that he could see no difference between adopting the African solution for smallpox and using the Native Americans' antidote for snake venom, which the colonists had readily taken up. Only one fit physician, Zabdiel Boylston, Zabdiel was willing to try the new method. He inoculated his son and the enslaved people he owned. In the end, the epidemic would wipe out more than 14% of Boston's population. But of the 240 people that Boylston had inoculated, only 6 died, 1 in 40 as against 1 in 7 people who forewent inoculation. By 1750, vaccinations based on the method introduced by Wunsimus would be standard practice in Massachusetts and later in the rest of the country. What is clear is that the knowledge he passed on saved hundreds of lives and led to the eventual eradication of smallpox, wrote the author Aaron Blakemore. It remains the only infectious disease to have been entirely wiped out. For his contribution to science, Wunsimus does not appear even to have fully won his freedom. What little that is known is that Mather grew sour on him, and Wunsimus managed to buy partial freedom by paying Mather money toward the purchase of another slave. He had gone well beyond what would have been expected of a man of the lowest caste, and as often happens, does not appear to have reaped the rewards for a role that was beyond his station. Are we doing a group discussion? What's going on there?
Yeah, I think that we may. I'm thinking that we probably not doing a group discussion.
No. What time is it?
5:33.
I'll finish this. Instead, the rewards and privileges flowed from upholding the caste order. Doing so could boost the prospects of those who knew to stay in their place. The more conspicuous, the better. 2 centuries after Wunsimus's day, the Jim Crow regime would make a single exception to its iron law of segregation between blacks and whites. It was for black maids who had shown themselves sufficiently faithful to be entrusted with the care of white children. These women alone could ride in the whites-only section of a train or bus if they were out taking care of a white child. This exception served several purposes. It enshrined the white child as the ticket to a first-class seat for a black person. It reinforced the servile role, the natural place of the subordinate caste. It elevated the black nursemaid by fiat of the dominant caste. It made domestics superior to even the likes of a great orator, Frederick Douglass, who was once reduced to sitting on top of cargo on a train journey. It protected the children of the dominant caste from enduring for a single trip the taint and discomforts of the colored car, and it reminded everyone in the subordinate caste that they would only rise with the permission of the dominant caste, and on its terms, and only as long as they kept to the role assigned them. They were to be given no quarter, no latitude to imagine themselves in any place other than the bottom rung. From Reconstruction to the Civil Rights era, Southern school boards spent as little as 1/10 the money on black schools as for white schools, openly starving them of resources that might afford them a chance to compete on level ground. School terms for black students were made shorter by months, giving them less time in class and more time in the field for the enrichment of the ruling caste. In hiring black teachers for segregated schools during Jim Crow, a leading Southern official, Hoke Smith, made a deliberate decision. When 2 Negro teachers applied to a school to take the less competent, it was a nakedly creative way to cripple black prospects for achievement. It put black children under the instruction of the least qualified teachers. It passed over the brightest, most accomplished applicants, in fact punished excellence, while elevating the mediocre in a purposeful distortion of meritocracy. All of this created dissension in the lowest caste over the patent unfairness and worked to crush the ambitions of those with the most talent. In these and other ways, the caste system trained the people in the lowest caste that the only way to survive was to play the comforting role of servile and competent. Oh, you knocked over your coffee. The caste system all but ensured black failure by preempting success. In the caste system, there can be little allowance for the disfavored caste to appear equal, much less superior at some human endeavor. In the early years of the Third Reich, the Nazis made a point of excluding Jews from any position of circumstance in which they might outshine Aryans. This extended to classrooms in which the Berlin Gestapo went to the trouble of ordering that everything must be done to put an end to the appearance that Aryan students are receiving assistance from Jews in preparing their exams. These were the ways that, irrespective of the natural range of intelligence and talent rising in any human subset, the people in the dominant caste were artificially propped up as superior in all things, a setup for disillusionment, not of their own making. If one of the requirements of a hierarchy is that the lowest caste must remain the scapegoat on the bottom, the culture works to keep it that way by playing up the stereotypes that affirm their lowliness and minimizing indications to the contrary. In America, news outlets feed audience a diet of inner-city crime and poverty so out of proportion to the numbers that they distort perceptions of African Americans and of societal issues as a whole. Little more than 1 in 5 African Americans, 22%, are poor, and they make up over a quarter of people in America, at 27%. But a 2017 study by Travis Dixon at the University of Illinois found that African Americans account for 59% of the poor people depicted in the news. White families make up 2/3 of America's poor, at 66%, but account for only 17% of poor people depicted in the news. These generations-old distortions shape popular sentiment. A political scientist at Yale, Martin Gillens, found in a 1994 study that 55% of Americans believe that all poor people in America were black. Thus, a majority have come to see black as a synonym for poor, a stigmatizing distortion in a country that glorifies affluence. Like poverty, crime too receives coverage out of proportion to the numbers. Crimes involving a black suspect and a white victim make up 42% of the crimes reported on television news, even though crimes with white victims and black suspects make up a minority of crimes. At 10%, according to the Sentencing Project, an advocate for criminal justice reform. For generations, the culture has decried the alarming rate of births among black teenagers, often accompanied by depictions of welfare dependency, even though the majority of teenage mothers of all races are unmarried and likely to require help. But one might not know from news coverage that the rate of black teenagers giving birth has plummeted in recent decades from 118 per 1,000 black teenagers in 1991 to 28 per 1,000 in 2017, according to a 2019 analysis by the nonprofit research institute Child Trends. This should be considered great news for society. The turnabout in birth rates for black and Latina teenagers has helped bring the overall teenage pregnancy rate to the lowest levels recorded in the modern era. Yet what little media coverage there has been has tended to revert to familiar caste tropes about unemployment and poverty, language of the 1990s, rather than looking into the reasons for the historic decline. These numbers are clearly telling us something, and they do not fit caste assumptions. The long-term downward trends, the researchers wrote, may reflect that teenagers are increasingly likely to delay sex and if sexually active, to use contraception more carefully, meaning that black and Latina teenagers are taking precautions at a rate that is bringing them closer to the mainstream, an outcome contrary to societal expectations and thus largely disregarded. The investment in the established hierarchy runs sufficiently deep that people in the dominant caste have historically been willing to forego conveniences to themselves to keep the fruits of citizenship within their own caste. After the Supreme Court outlawed segregation in public schools in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, the white-run school board in Prince Edward County, Virginia, delayed integrating as long as it could and then shut down the school system entirely rather than allow black students into classrooms with white students. The county had no public schools for 5 years, from 1959 to 1964, forcing parents of both races to find alternatives for their children. Local whites diverted government funds to private academies for white students, while black parents whose tax dollars were now going to the white students had to make do on their own. Around the same time, civil rights legislation outlawed segregation in public facilities, and in response, cities in the South closed, auctioned off, or poured concrete into their white-only pools so that nobody could swim, rather than sharing the water with black people. But those in the dominant caste had the means and resources acquired over generations of collective income and wealth disparities to build private pools behind gated communities for themselves and their children, leaving the lowest caste locked out again. It is in these ways that a caste system shapeshifts and protects its beneficiaries. A workaround emerges, provisions are made, and the hierarchy remains intact. Even in the face of challenges from the highest authority in the land, this is how a caste system, it seems, manages always to prevail. In-group, out-group tensions remain a feature of American life. When black teenagers attended a pool party in a predominantly white gated community in McKinney, Texas in 2015, white residents called the police on them for trespassing. Afterward, as shown in a video that drew international attention, an officer who responded to the call yanked a 15-year-old girl from the sidewalk, slammed her to the ground face down, and pinned her with his full weight. Here was a grown man with his knees bearing down on her slight bikini-clad frame as she sobbed helpless beneath him. When black boys instinctively rushed to help her, the officer pointed his gun at them and they backed away, the full power of the state treating them as children but as threats to society. It was a scene that would be hard to imagine occurring with a young girl from the same caste, the dominant caste, as the officer. Within days, the officer resigned, but the incident demonstrated the depth of assumptions about who belongs where in a caste society, and the instantaneous walls erected and punishments meted out for breaching those boundaries, even in our era. All right, that was chapter 15 of Caste. We're going back to do yesterday's book because we didn't finish it, and we're done with today's book, which is A Peculiar Indifference, the neglected toll of violence on Black America by Elliot Curry. There seems to be some kind of shooting or something. I don't know. There's massive amounts of police driving by right now. We're going to end this live and come back in a few minutes with a different reader or group discussion maybe.